Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It's time to crank this rascal up. Whenever we do crank it up, it's usually because we have Dale Buckner joining us. Dale's the CEO of Global Guardian. He's a retired Special Forces, a Green Beret officer. He's the founder and president, CEO of Global Guardian. He's lived and operated in over 7 countries globally. We always ask Dale to join us these days because we think that there's a lot of information that you guys need to hear about around keeping your people safe and secure, not just when they're traveling, but when they're working at all the locations that you have around the country and around the globe. And that's what Global Guardian does. They assist companies like yours in developing your policies, for mobile employees. And as we were just discussing before this, you heard, they also do things like help you orient employees that are traveling to potentially challenging places. And if things go wrong, they are your partner in solving and bring those challenges, but also bringing an extraordinary array of solutions. For instance, when the cold snap hit Texas, they were staged in states next to Texas to go in and assist when other resources weren't available. So, and today, as I mentioned in the prelude, as we finished the last program, is that with the onset of these, or the evolution of these attacks going on in the United States, it's not just international travel that we need to think about, it's also the domestic aspect as well. And if you think your workers' comp is going to cover you, keep in mind that many comp policies end after a certain radius or after a certain number of days. So there's a lot going on in this space. We want to make sure you become aware of it. And we've got the best person literally in the world to talk to you about it. And he's going to bring us up to date on what's going on in our country and around the world. Please welcome Mr. Dale Buckner.
Stephen, thank you. Couple of things. I will focus in for this audience a little more on the US, but I will start with the world and then work my way in. You're going to see that I'll end here in the United States. I admittedly do have a global perspective for the most part. I've lived abroad most of my adult life. I have not lived in the United States after I went to college very much, frankly. I like to consider myself a global citizen, if you will. Knowing we have 30 minutes and I'm looking at the clock now, I will try and get through my brief in about 12 to 13 minutes. And then I really do enjoy the Q&A of this more than anything else. And my request of you in the audience is this: be skeptical, challenge my thesis, tell me I'm wrong. I'm an adult, I can take the beatings, I won't get upset. I'm not telling you I know everything by any means. I'm going to tell you what I think, and I will answer your questions with absolutely zero political spin. I'm going to tell you what I think based on fact as I know it, and I will talk about anything. You want to talk about police, you want to talk about racial injustice, you want to talk about LGBT, I don't care what the topic is. Nothing's off limits with me. I'll talk about anything, and I will tell you what I believe in that space without pulling any punches. As you see on this slide, I am going to start with COVID-19, very strategic level, just a couple of highlights. I know you're all getting an overdose of this daily on your computer, on the news, and and on the radio when you're driving your car. But I will give you just a couple of data points there and some cautionary tale. 2, I want to talk about the changing security situation now that we're starting to see countries vaccinated, both in the US and abroad. And then lastly, I do want to talk about travel because it's going to be very nuanced, this rollout from now through 2023. Next slide. So as you look at this slide, and these numbers, of course, are changing minute by minute, I really only have a couple of things to point out, and I certainly don't want to insult the audience because I know you're getting a full dose of this. One, as you look at the left-hand side of that slide, look at the top 15 countries in the world in those numbers. The thing that has evolved, excuse me, and that's really stood out since COVID really started to get momentum in March of 2020. So we're going into 14 months of this, is that when that first popped up, it was very Asian-centric with the US on top. It had very few countries in Central South America, and it had a little bit of population in Europe. And that was really the makeup. And now this is really pivoted to where the US has been on top for a long, long time. Central South America and India, specifically in Central South America, Brazil and India have come roaring back, and we'll get into that. And then you see quite a few countries in Europe and then Central South America. What you don't see is the Middle East, and you don't see Asia. Now, that being said, I think there's a cautionary tale here. Some countries are providing real data, and there are entire parts of the world that we have no data on at all. Poor countries that are not sophisticated enough to gather data on the countryside simply are not they're not set up to provide that kind of information. So you have to take all of this with a grain of salt based on the data we have. And you have to accept that all of this data is flawed. Even in the United States, it's flawed. But at least gives us some sense of structure. Two, if you look at the bottom tagline in red, this is my only other point, we'll move on. I will get into this, but the vaccines are working. We're seeing wide distribution in certain parts of the population, in certain countries, which I'm going to show you next. Here's my message to all of you. The third world is being left behind, and the West right now is not moving fast enough. We're having a tough enough time taking care of the West, and rich countries in the Middle East and rich countries in Asia are taking care of themselves first. Understandable. The bottom line is the third world's being left behind, which leads to this word variant. I'm not a doctor, don't profess to understand medicine, but this word variant, as this is given more time in places like the undeveloped world in Central South America and primarily Africa, if these variants are given enough time and mutate to the point where our vaccines don't work, or it requires multiple boosters, that is now the number one risk in our mind of how we get out of the situation we're in. And can we? And if the variants get out of control and they get beyond our capability with the vaccines we're using, we could go right back. We could go backwards, right back to where we were 14 months ago. And that's scary. Now, we're not there yet. And so far, so good. We think it'll hold, but there's no guarantees here. And that's really the message. Next slide. Here you see this is a good news, bad news story on vaccinations. The good news is this. Top 8 countries in the world where we're 30+% of the population being vaccinated. Some countries are now approaching over 70%. Number 1 is Israel, the UAE, Chile, the UK, Hungary, Mongolia, Siberia, Uganda, and of course, the United States. Those countries are doing incredibly well. And when we get to the end, that's going to be how we get out of this. That's how we're going to open economies. That's how we're going to all get going in business, is through that system. Now, here's the bad news. We have almost no data on the other half of the world. And again, if we're expecting the US government and plus the European Union and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to vaccinate the rest of the world, we've got trouble ahead potentially. There's real risk with that. Depending on, USAID and the State Department and other, organizations like that, the problem is it's bureaucratic, it's slow, it's got to be funded, and we're just not there yet. So again, there's some real risk there. Lastly, for the developed world, let me reiterate, the developed world, we should start to stabilize by this fall. End of third quarter, fourth quarter of this year, we believe will stabilize. That will open up travel corridors. That will open up commerce. That will open up economies. There will still be real risk. It's not the end of the yellow brick road and everything's going to be perfect. This is going to go on for several years, potentially, especially in the third world. And I just want to hammer that message that risk is still out there, even if the West gets it together and the wealthier populations and countries of Asia and the Middle East. Next slide. Bad news slide. I'll sound like Darth Vader here a little bit. I don't mean to be Debbie Downer, but I have to point this out. In March of 2020 through about June or July of 2020, we saw global conflict go to ground. We saw murder rates go to ground. We saw trafficking of drugs and human beings go to ground. Entire borders, airspace being closed. All of those things brought and tamped down a lot of these conflicts and a lot of these, illicit activities, if you will, on a global scale. And I think everybody saw that. You read it, you heard it, and you're right here in your neighborhoods and in major cities in the US. You were just hearing about how all these things started to go away. That's the upside. Here's the downside and the message to all of you on the global scale. And we'll come back to the US at the end. Every single global conflict that we had pre-COVID is raging back right now. Watch the news. North Korea is already firing rockets again. They're already threatening the West again. It's as if this never happened. Afghanistan, as we're executing our withdrawal, is now violence is spiking. The Taliban owns and controls over 75% of the country. And by the time we leave, it'll probably be 90% of the country. It will literally be as if we were never there after 20 plus years of war. Lebanon, of course, you're watching the instability with the government, the protests of the people, and just the dissatisfaction with what's going on with their government. Myanmar, we've been operating Myanmar now for months. In our opinion, Myanmar, if you're not watching, is close to becoming a failed state in the next year or so. There is nothing the UN, there is nothing the US, there is nothing the European Union is going to do to stop what's happening with the Myanmar, with the coup and the military taking over the government. China is not going to move. Thailand's not going to move. India is not going to move. It will stay in its current state until there is some material reason to move the dial and have free and fair democratic elections again. And right now, we don't see that anytime in the next year or so. And most Western businesses have not come to that realization just yet, unfortunately. Iran, the United States, we are trying to find a way. 3 weeks ago, we were in Europe trying to restart these talks. We are not very optimistic that this is going to get done. We are not very optimistic they're going to come to the table and find terms. We are not very optimistic we're going to find the outcome we're looking for diplomatically. If you're watching Iran, there was just another major attack. Of course, Israel was the suspect of who was operating and disrupting the nuclear program in Iran. We think that's going to continue. There is no easy answer here on Iran whatsoever, both diplomatically or conflict. Cyber, of course, if you watch Solar Winds, the NSA, the Pentagon, CIA were all penetrated. The United States government to this day has never disclosed how bad those penetrations were. The assumption is they're much worse than what you're being told. If you watch the news every single month, Target's hacked, Walmart's hacked, Starbucks is hacked, it's Amazon is hacked, Facebook is hacked. We in the West have not figured out cyber. Nobody in the world has figured out cyber. No one in the world has a one-button solution for cyber. It has to be multi-layered, and it has to be followed all the way to the end user, all the way to your individual employee cell phone and laptop. If it not, you are guaranteed that it's not if, but when. And people that think because they have an enterprise cyber solution at their enterprise level of the company, that doesn't protect the end user, it doesn't travel protection into Russia, it doesn't protect when you're going into China, so on and so forth. We have not figured this out. Even the US government our estimation is about 22 years behind schedule on protecting the country properly. If it wasn't the case, just in the last 5 months, we wouldn't have the CIA and DOD and the NSA being hacked at the levels they are. It's a problem, both in corporate and as a nation. And then lastly, we anticipate the terrorist attack threat will come back over the next 18 months in a real way in the United States. Prior to COVID, the New York City Police Department had thwarted well over 120 direct terrorist attacks in a very short period of time. That will come back. Next slide. Right here, right as you look at this in the global security situation, the one comment here is, if you look at the direct overlay of the spikes in crime, violence, and instability in the world, all those countries that are in red, that are hotspots, automatically transition over. Because if there's no opportunity and you have poor governments and they cannot provide essential services to their population, why would COVID be any different? So all the countries that had problems economically and infrastructure and corruption and crime and violence before COVID, of course, are going to be on the very end of getting vaccinated, which is going to create even more turmoil. So as you look at this, here is really the takeaway for all of you. If Somalia was high risk, it's now extreme high risk. If Mexico was high risk prior to COVID, it's now extreme high risk. If you were going to Hungary and that was medium risk, you need to assumption it's now high risk. You assume that it's high risk. If you're going in and out of Hong Kong with what the Chinese government is doing, the elevation of Hong Kong falling is an elevated risk. All of these countries, as you come out of this, it's going to take about a year to figure out what used to be medium risk is now high risk. What used to be high risk is now extreme high risk. That mentality has to be prevailing through your HR, your security officers, and your chief information security officers, because that's now the world we're going to inherit as we start to open back up. Next slide. I'm going to finish up here so we can get into Q&A. Here in the US, I know you've been hearing this. We have a gun problem. We have a police problem. We have a crime problem. We have a carjacking problem. We have a murder rate problem. We have a lot of problems. I'm 52 years old. I served in special forces in the infantry and military intelligence for a long time. I never thought in my lifetime that I would see the United States at conflict with itself over its sexuality, over its politics, over its race, and over its religion. We're in uncharted territory right now. And I would say this, and you can happily beat me up for it. The extreme right and the extreme right or extreme left in this country are both wrong. They're both wrong. On the police discussion, which is a hot topic, of course, we as a population expect our police to solve all our problems. We want the police to solve our drug problem. We want them to solve our mental illness problem. We want them to police people that are down and have unemployment issues and mental problems and so on and so forth. And that's not fair. The police are just like any other organization. There are going to be bad police too. Admittedly, we've seen that. We have to admit that there are bad people in your organization. There's bad people in my organization. That's the human condition. We cannot change that. At the same time, we don't fund our police properly. We don't train our police properly, and we expect way too much from our police. Bottom line is we're going to struggle with this. We're not there. We don't have the right policy. We don't have the right funding, and we've got to find a way out of this. And right now it is not pretty in our country. We can have the gun debate all day long. I carried a gun almost materially every day of my life. I'm happy to have that conversation anytime you want. Ultimately, here's my biggest fear. Look at the right side of that chart. Look at those cities. Red, blue, none of that matters. None of that matters. We have a murder rate, the highest murder rates in this country we've ever seen, ever. That's a problem. That means our society is not nearly as stable as we think. That means our population and our country is not as stable as we think. The people at the bottom rung of our society are not as stable as we think. They're much more vulnerable than we think. And ultimately, desperate people do desperate things. That's where we're at. Next slide. Return to travel. We tied this to GDP. We really think the economy's on the march. You can see where we're going to cross into positive territory on the left side of the slide. On the right side, we are projecting the end of fourth quarter, that we're at 80% of business travel, not combination of leisure, not travel in general, but business travel within those corridors of the US to London, US to Paris, US to Germany, New Zealand to Australia, pockets of all the Europeans opening up to other European border countries. Those pockets are going to start opening as Israel opens, as Hungary opens, as the UAE opens, because they've reached herd immunity. That's how we're going to get out of this. Ultimately, though, we do believe it's 2023 before we get to pre-COVID numbers. Next slide. And last slide. If you've gone through COVID, I will ask these questions. How do you think your insurance worked during COVID? How do you think your vendors for travel and medical evac and security evacuations, how did they perform? When borders and airspace closed, could you still get your people out? Because there is a way to get them out. And if you took no for an answer because the State Department put out a travel level 4, no travel, and you're no longer covered, you've got the wrong insurance and the wrong vendors, period. We need to change the definition of duty of care. Duty of care, there's actually has to be care. Just because you put out a travel intel brief and you track where people's flights and hotels are, that means nothing once the crisis starts. It does nothing. If you read the fine print in your medical insurance and COVID's not covered for evac or hospital stays, you got to reevaluate what you're using for healthcare. India right now is in total free fall. The entire Western insurance model has failed. All of the legacy medical providers have failed because they have the wrong model. You know, doctors based in the United States and the UK and Singapore cannot legally assign a prescription for India. If you don't have a team on the ground, you don't have Indian medical professionals on your team, a Western hotline is useless to you. It will do nothing for you. Finding beds and sending people in India right now for healthcare is the absolute last thing you want to do, because all you're doing is knowingly sending them to a hospital that does not have beds, does not have oxygen, and is a petri dish of COVID. The real option is bring oxygen to that individual, isolate them, bring medicine, bring food, and isolate them. The last thing you want to do is take them to a hospital. The whole system has failed because we didn't adjust for a pandemic. How do you think the U.S. State Department, embassies did? How do you think the U.S. FAA did? All of them failed massively. It took 11 months to get a coherent policy on travel for COVID. 11 months it took to create one policy so that Delta Airlines, United Airlines, the Emirates, all those CEOs weren't fending for themselves. We had no one standard for the entire hospitality industry. All the hotels had to make their own policy. There was nothing supporting them from the federal government and the international community. Bottom line is that last bullet. If your mentality at your firm is you're not preparing for the next global disruption, you're already behind. There are 2 to 3 global disruptions coming as we come out of COVID, whether that's a terrorist attack, whether that is a natural disaster, or whether that is something else in the biological world. So I'll pause there, Stephen, and take questions.
Yeah, Dale, thank you. Woo! Dose of reality, brother. Yeah. It's always fascinating to get the statistics that you bring and to hear your perspective. Thank you very much. Listen, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but at the same time, I do want people to understand how challenging it is. And I know you've got people on the ground in India, and I know you just shared a few things with us about that, but just how bad is it in India? I know we're seeing a lot in the media, but I'm also hearing that it's actually underreported, as hard to believe as that is. What's your perspective?
Yep. So Stephen, you're right on point. And here's why. It's very simple. The numbers you see reported in the Western media are based on the medical system from hospital to clinic feeding up to the central government. If we're losing 3,000 people a day, that's reported through the medical system. The number of people dying in their homes in India, we anticipate is 7 to 10x that. The people, our teams on the ground are literally watching entire city streets being blocked off. They burn bodies in the streets as fast as humanly possible. They cannot dig enough graves fast enough. A majority of those people are not coming out of hospitals or clinics. They're dying in their home. This is 7 to 10x worse than what you see statistically is the estimate.
Goodness, that's horrible. Well, okay, well, I want to bring it back to a little more practical aspect for this group, and that is that Dale, we've talked a lot, in our travel risk programs with you, how a lot of businesses are, they're not letting their employees travel right now, right? Yep. And with good reason.
Yes.
Duty of care, of course, and that's a good thing. But here's the thing, we do ultimately want to get people back on the road, right? But as we've talked about, it sounds like it's going to be pretty expensive because I've got to get them tested. I've got to get them vaccinated. I've got to comply with each individual area and the restrictions, right? I have to, and they might have to quarantine. They might have to quarantine when they come back. I got to get them tested before they come back. They might have to quarantine when they come back. So all of a sudden, Dale, that business, that 1-day business trip, that 2-day business trip, that regional manager goes in to check on 5 or 10 franchises, that just becomes cost prohibitive. Do you agree?
Yes, I think, excuse me, it can be cost prohibitive. And here is ultimately the calculus. And the word we use is trust. If there is a transaction in your business that requires trust to be built, where you physically have to touch something to validate, confirm or deny what the status of that business unit is, the status of what's happening in that business, and trust needs to be established. That's the criteria where you're going to go through all these, all the hoops to execute that journey of pre-test, quarantine, retest, and then if they do get sick on the road, that you're going to take that expense, and if your insurance doesn't cover it, your vendor doesn't cover it, that you're now going to pay for that risk. Everything you described, Stephen, is 100% spot on. And again, I think you're going to have to calculate where are the safest travel corridors where you can get rid of some of those things on the journey checklist and minimize it. If you can take 3 of those things off and travel with confidence, you're going to go to those travel corridors. The rest of the world's going to have to wait. Unless this is a multi-million-dollar merger, this is a new merger you did pre-COVID, and now you've got to get that business unit up and running, and you need a leader on the ground. That's the way to think through this in our minds. It's got to be based on what's feasible. And then if you're going to take risk, think through all the journey and all the potential expenses. If you're willing to accept that because the risk reward is there, then you pull that trigger and you execute it. And that's just basic framework.
Yeah, that's interesting. We're just not near ready to exit the Zoom room, are we?
No,
I mean, not yet. Yeah, and I know that's difficult news for everybody on this Zoom to listen to, but Dale and I we've been talking about this for what? Well, since it started, right? And ladies and gentlemen, when he tells you that some other things are going to happen, please keep in mind, and I'm not tooting our horn, but 2 years ago, we did a travel risks war game where we war gamed a virus that impacted the world, and here we go. So just keep that in mind. Dale, we've got a great question that's come in from Jeff Moore, and before I get to the question, I want to let everybody know about Jeff because of the research that he's doing. He has put together an extraordinary database around terrorist attacks around the world. Hey, Jeff, that primarily impacted hotels, but of course that impacts all of us. But certainly if you're interested in that space, reach out to Jeff to get more information about that research because it's terrific. But Dale, Jeff's question is, we're seeing these strikes and protests in Chile and in Colombia and of course other places. And Jeff is curious, from your perspective, do you think we're going to see that level of unrest in the United States anytime soon?
So my answer is this. One, I fully acknowledge what's going on in the world. I have an entire intel cell. It briefs me daily, weekly, and we're watching all of it, of course. That drives my comment about, pre-COVID, if a country is medium, you have to assume it's high. If it was high, you have to assume it's extremely high. As we come out of this, we'll see it play out, and nobody knows that time. Here's my comment about the United States. Is number one, nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. No one predicted Pearl Harbor. Nobody predicted 9/11. Nobody predicted the Paris attacks. Nobody predicted the Sri Lanka bombing, so on and so forth. Certainly no one predicted, and I'm, again, 52 years old. I never saw in my lifetime what happened at the Capitol happening. And we responded to that. We took on 16 congressmen and congresswomen, and we ended up doing a lot of executive protection and family protection and home protection, all that stuff after. I didn't see that coming. We put out an intel brief, avoid DC 2 nights prior. But did I see that level of violence? We did not predict that. So my response to Jeff is this. Number one, it's completely unpredictable. Anything could happen. Statistically, with the economy coming back, here's why I'm hedging my bet that even with that conflict I'm talking about of we're fighting over sexuality, politics, religion, all these things that we're fighting ourselves in a way I've never seen in the US. I've only seen it abroad. My answer is this: the United States is going to come out of this much quicker than most of the world. And when people are employed and they have a job and they have income, that creates stability. I think that alone is the number one reason the population, we won't see mass attacks. We won't see mass protests. We're going to continue to have protest over police. We're going to continue to have protests over social injustice. We're going to continue to have protests over COVID and masks. You're not going to get around that. But do I think we're going to kill each other at the scale of other countries in these protests? I don't, because I think the financial stability and the bedrock of our economy keeps our population tamped down. And I think when you look at what the administration did, they threw so much money at this that we actually are going to hurt ourselves, because we could actually come out of this quicker if we get rid of some of the unemployment benefits and things like that and get more people back to work faster. Ultimately, though, I would say, Jeff, I don't think we're going to see that level of violence that we see in other countries, although we have incredibly high murder rates, no question. The assumption is we're going to come out of this, we stabilize, those rates start to come down on murder and crime, although there's still a lot of friction. That being said, make no mistake, I've never seen the undercurrent of what's going on in the United States with domestic terrorism and the conflict and friction that we have in this country right now. And it's very scary. And it tells me this: the United States is just a couple of years from falling off the ledge and looking like the rest of the world. If enough of our population below the poverty line falls off, that's when we get in real trouble. And that's what you've seen with the unemployment and COVID and everything else. That's how we get these murder rates. That's how we get this conflict. So my answer is convoluted. I think we are going to be stable. I think we'll come out of it because of the economy, and it creates stability. Could anything happen? Absolutely. And could we have real strife politically and so on and so forth? Yes. And again, nobody predicted the Capitol. That nobody. I didn't see one intel firm in my business, in my space, that properly predicted that. Nobody. So that means it can happen. And that's kind of the scary part, frankly.
Yeah, for sure. And Dale, just to validate your point about the economic stability and why tax policy is so important and why the social nets are so important, because when you look at countries like Chile and Colombia, et cetera, Honduras, et cetera, you're looking at extraordinarily high numbers of people in poverty. Yep. And that creates the civil unrest, right? And that's why closing that wealth gap becomes, we've learned this over and over again, but we don't put the solutions in place. Yep. I was reading a paper just yesterday. I think Colombia's poverty rate, and listen, Colombia is often cited as one of the economic powerhouses in South America, and yet their poverty rate is somewhere north of 40%, I think. So, and those strikes and protests, came about because the government was trying to implement higher taxes on the middle class. Right. There's just no more money to milk there. Listen, right. We got another question in the pipeline, and I want to be mindful of our time. But before I get to that meeting question, and I will, Joe, I want to talk to Dale about executive protection. Dale, you mentioned that. But one of the things I think this audience needs to hear, Dale, because as we've talked, I just feel like the hotel and restaurant communities, especially the larger operators, they are a little behind the curve in terms of travel risk mitigation, not just for their customers, but for their employees. So when we think about executive protection, I want to be sure that we're on the same page as you. Like I have suggested for many years that the C-suite should not travel together on a plane. They should not travel together in an Uber or in a limousine. They should not travel. They should not stay at the same hotel when you're holding a conference. Tell a little bit, how do you feel about that? Do you still feel the same way? And anything else that we've left out?
Yeah. So this is, when you think about this, you really have two populations. Number one is the C-suite, because those people are considered an asset, right? You have to protect them like an asset. Number two, you have your high volume travelers or your business units that might be in medium to high risk countries around the world. It might be outsourcing in India, for example. So when you look at this, I think the way of the world, pre-COVID, COVID, post-COVID, there's no denying that cheap insurance got away with for about 70 years, cheap insurance, because we all kind of prayed that bad things wouldn't happen. And now you are literally, and you have to accept this reality. There are about 2 to 3 major global disruptions a year now. And whether that is terrorism, whether that's natural disaster between earthquake and hurricane, or whether it's what we're facing now, or it's an economic downturn, where it creates real risk for the C-suite and your high volume travelers. Ultimately, and it's country by country. Don't like, I think your people can use Uber in London. I wouldn't have real issue with that. But would I have issue with Uber in Mexico City or Bogota or parts of the Middle East in Kuwait City? The answer is absolutely. So the policy has to be, of course, condition based on that country. But the overarching, thought here is you should, if you've got a conference and the top 15 people in your company are there, you should at least split them in half. You should at least have them split in half on the aircraft that flies over. If you're using a mix of a private jet and the rest are going commercial, you should split them out so you don't lose a chunk if there's a major event like that. And I just don't think that using a limo or Uber or a taxi in many of these capital cities at this day and age, with what we're about to walk into post-COVID, makes a lot of sense. And if you don't have those policies and you just think that everybody can use Uber in every capital city in the world, you're almost guaranteed you're going to have issues here. You watch the number of assaults, sexual assaults, and then kidnap and ransom. Wait till you see, coming out of COVID, the kidnap and ransom industry. It's going to go up exponentially. There's no doubt, as you have people going into these certain markets that have high risk K&R profiles, they're going to be extreme high risk now coming out of COVID, because there is so much uncertainty in that market now where people are desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. So all of these policies, you're really going to have to change and update, and you're going to have to use a real system. As I concluded with, do you think insurance performed well in COVID? Do you think your vendors perform well in COVID? And the answer 90% of the time that we find is they realize this shined a light on the weakness of all those models.
Yeah. Yeah, listen, and that just points out what we're talking about here, ladies and gentlemen, is business continuity, right? You've got to have some institutional memory, right? All of the people in the C-suite have a fiduciary obligation to the organization and shareholders. And if they all go down with the ship, your business continuity is in real trouble. Dale, we've got time for one last question. We got to make it relatively quick, but the question came through about face-to-face meetings. And we've talked a lot about this. Obviously, a lot's going to depend on the regulation that's in the particular area where you want to do it. But it's not just about COVID today, for all the reasons you're saying, right? It's about have convention centers beefed up their security, have hotels taken steps to beef up their securities when there is civil unrest, et cetera. But what's your take? The question was actually, do you recommend face-to-face meetings right now? Do you recommend these large gatherings? They'd like to know what you think about that.
So it depends on what country and what are the conditions in that country. So I can't give you a blanket for the world. I can talk about the United States and Israel and the UAE and the UK, where we are going to get close to herd immunity, if not get there. Obviously, Israel is they're going to reach herd immunity before, and the UAE will probably reach before we do, but guaranteed. So number one, my first part of the answer is it depends on the market. Where are you going? What city? And what is the venue? If you're going to one of these places that's doing incredibly well in the vaccination rate, and your people are vaccinated, and you have a testing regimen that's readily available, which is now getting tested in most of these mature markets, there's nothing to it at this point. You can get rapid tests everywhere. So I think that as you look at this, again, where is it? What is the current condition? What are you going to prepare on the ground to make sure it's as safe as it can be? And if all of those things match, and meeting in person has value, it actually creates value versus doing it through email and VTC. There's actual value to that board meeting, for example, in person, where you can simply dive into issues and get more done. and it meets all those criteria, and you're willing to take that risk, the financial risk, if someone does get sick, that you are going to medevac them and get them to proper care, even if your insurance doesn't cover it or your vendor doesn't cover it, then my answer is go. But you've got to do the analysis up front. You've got to go through that exercise. And if you get to the end and it all makes good sense and the risk reward is there, I say go. If it's not, then you're stuck with what you have until we get to the next phase of this and see more of the developed world open up, become stable, and have much, much less risk.
Yeah, Joe, I'm going to add to that a little bit. I think Dale's right on target. You mentioned California. Obviously, they're trying to open up, but still, listen, even with vaccines, my personal belief, and Dale and I do a lot of work in this travel risk space, people should still be wearing masks. They should be distant, washing the hands, sanitizer. I mean, I'm just not sure that's ever going to go away, because but we can talk more about that at one of our conferences. But to give you an indication, the GBTA, the Global Business Travel Association, they postponed their large face-to-face meeting from the summer, I think, Dale, right, until the fall.
Yep.
And we chose to host this one virtually as well, even though it's a much smaller, intimate conference. We're going to try to do a face-to-face in October with fewer than 100 people, doing it hybrid. And I think that's more likely what I would be willing to recommend to people, where you could space appropriately. There just aren't a lot of spaces out there that can hold 10, 15,000 people and space appropriately, right? And then if you add in some of the issues that Dale talked about in terms of domestic violence, you've got some other challenges that I'm just not convinced the meeting venues are ready to address yet. That's my perspective. Dale, some final thoughts?
No, I agree with that. Again, I think it's the individual analysis down to that event. This is going, it's May. It's the 5th of May, correct? Yeah, the 5th of May. As much as I want to believe that by the end of third quarter, as I predicted in that slide, that we will get back to 70, 80% of business travel, I still think we have a shot at that. But do I think there could be a variant that comes and throws us off course? I do. Do I think that internationally or right here in the United States, we can have a security event that disrupts us getting back to quote unquote normal or some version of normal? It absolutely could happen. No one knows that. And again, no one predicted the situation we're in. So I think that as you look through this, my message to all of you to conclude is this: do the analysis. Do not get stuck in the old template of what you had pre-COVID. Do not be comfortable with what your policy was, or your insurance policy was, or your vendor network was. If your vendors didn't perform well in COVID, then you need to relook it. If your insurance didn't perform well, relook it. Ultimately, as you go through the calculus, don't rely on the old template, because it's a new world now, and it's going to change every single month. The conditions on the ground globally and right here in the United States, state by state, city by city, are going to be changing every month materially. So this is an environment that's super dynamic. You're going to have to put in the time. You're going to have to read the stats. You're going to have to do the analysis. And ultimately, internally, you're going to have to do the calculus of risk reward. That would be my message to everybody. We're not there yet. We're not out of the woods. We're not secure yet. We're working in the right direction, but there are all kinds of pitfalls and landmines to the right and left of every step we take. We're not there yet. That's my message.
Yeah, and those variants, as you pointed out, they're the wild card.
100%.
For sure. Yeah.
100%.
Dale, can't thank you enough. As always, thank you so much. I'm really glad our audience got to hear this session. Ladies